What is going on, guys? Today I want to talk about 13 reasons why your leopard gecko is not eating. So I have this nifty Google Doc here, and I will leave this in the description below in case you want to use this as a checklist for yourself. So let's run through a few of the main reasons why a leopard gecko is not eating, and then there's a lot of reasons that could tie into why it's not eating. Now, this is a question I get a lot, and whenever I get this question, I need to ask a lot of clarifying questions to the person who's asking me, why is my gecko not eating? Because it could be anything from this list. And if I did not think of something from this list, leave it in a comment below or shoot me a text message and I will be sure to take note of that for future videos. But these were all of the reasons of why I could think for this video that a leopard gecko would not eat. First and foremost, these first couple ones are really important, and they're usually the main reason why a gecko is not eating. Reason number one, the gecko is brand new. It could take anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months for a brand new gecko to adjust to its new environment. Some geckos get eating right away from day one within a couple hours. Some geckos eat within a couple days. Some geckos eat within a couple weeks. I've seen geckos go up to 2 months without eating in a new environment. Now, the better the environment is set up, the quicker the gecko will adjust. And if you leave food in a bowl in the environment, that's even better because the gecko can then eat at its own leisure during the day when you're not there standing over it throwing crickets in its cage, which could be pretty scary for a brand new gecko. And talking about food, that actually reminded me of one more reason to add why a leopard gecko would not eat. So now we have 14 reasons that I'll talk about at the very bottom here. Now, for this reason, because a lot of leopard geckos don't eat right away when they get into a new environment, I always personally like to make sure that our geckos are well fed and well nourished, 20 plus grams, but also good body shape, thick muscle to fat ratio, good sized tail before they are sent out. So make sure they're chunky. The next, and one of the most common reasons why a leopard gecko would not eat, is if it's a female and if she's ovulating. Females will ovulate about once a year for a period of about 4 months. It could be anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 months. And during this time, the leopard gecko will either not slow down at all, it will slow down how much it's eating, or it will stop eating completely. And every female is a little bit different. So whenever somebody asks me, my gecko's not eating, what could it be? One of the questions I ask them is it a female? Is she ovulating? Leopard geckos are super easy to tell if they're ovulating. You can see pink dots under their belly. I'll leave a video here in the top right corner to some of our videos of how to tell if your leopard gecko is ovulating. Now, the next reason we're going to cover is brumation. This is something that captive geckos really don't go through too much anymore unless people brumate their geckos on purpose. Most leopard geckos usually will not brumate, but they might have like an inkling of an instinct to slow down or go off of food for a period of a couple weeks to a couple months out of the year when the air pressures drop in your area. Now, this is important. Even if you keep your gecko's lights and heat on 24/7, 365 the same all year long, as the wintertime comes, there's different pressures in the air that the gecko can actually sense, and that can make them go off of food. So a trick for this one is just keep their temperatures and everything stable. Keep it the same, and that will ensure that your leopard gecko will have the highest chance of bouncing back out of brumation or never going into it at all. The fourth one is MBD, which is short for metabolic bone disease. Now, there's going to be a number of reasons on this list that are linked to stress, okay? I wouldn't quite call ovulation stress or brumation stress. I guess you could say a new gecko in a new environment is stress, so I probably should have put stress there, but there are a specific type of stress that I labeled a few of them in the subsequent ones that we're going to go through here that are really, really stressing the animal out to a point of discomfort, which puts it in a place of where it might not want to eat. And metabolic bone disease is absolutely one of those. If you haven't seen my video on metabolic bone disease, please, please, please watch it. It's in the top right corner here. It's the #1 killer of reptiles, and especially cheap and easy reptiles like leopard geckos, bearded dragons, because people just don't realize that leopard geckos and other types of reptiles, they need to process and absorb the calcium that they are taking into their body, which is why I always recommend to get calcium with D3, even if you're using a UVB bulb, even if you're housing your reptiles outside like we do with our tegus, even if they have high UVB like we do with our sailfins, always use D3. There is In my mind, absolutely no reason why a reptile should be using calcium without D3. The chances of overdosing on D3 are so insignificant. You never see it in the hobby. And if you read scientific research and papers on it, it just doesn't happen. Is it possible to overdose on D3? Sure, but I gotta let you know, I've never personally seen it. And all of our tegus that live outside, our sailfins that have high UVB, they get D3 with every single one of their insect meals or their meat meals that don't have calcium with D3 in it. And I've never, ever, ever had a problem, never seen any overdoses whatsoever. And all of our animals are strong, tough, healthy. And so that would be my defense for always recommending calcium with D3 and just simplifying that process there. And then if you do calcium with D3, you won't have to worry about metabolic bone disease, which is again, the #1 killer of leopard geckos and reptiles alike in our hobby. The 5th reason is birth conditions. So the gecko might be born with poor bone structure. It might be born runty or stunted. It might be born with physical deformities. I once had a leopard gecko born with a backwards arm, and I could see like a blue blood vessel going to its heart, and I thought for sure, because of the backwards arm, the blue blood vessel that I was seeing was a clot and the gecko was going to have a heart attack and died. Come to find out, the gecko is perfectly fine. I think we eventually wound up selling it as a pet as an adult later on in life, and it lives, to my knowledge, it still lives to this day, a perfectly good and healthy life. But I observed that gecko for the first year plus, maybe 2 years of its life, and the gecko was great. That arm caused no issues whatsoever, except a little hobble as it walked. And I'm surprised I haven't seen this yet. I've spoken to breeders that have not produced as many geckos as I have produced, and they've experienced 2-headed animals, which is absolutely insane. Now, as cool as it sounds, you don't want a 2-headed animal because it is a level of stress for the animal. And I know there's a number of 2-headed reptiles that are born, turtles, lizards, snakes, every single year in the hobby. And out of the thousands of geckos that I produced, I expected I would have produced a 2-headed one by now, but I haven't yet. And so if I do produce a 2-headed one, then I can have more hands-on observation of the developmental stages that that animal goes through personally, and I can make critical feedback and commentary based on what I see. But I have had a backwards arm gecko and many other types of things, you know, that we normally encounter, stunted, runty geckos, poor bone structure, that can certainly happen. And all of these things cause stress to the gecko, and stress could make the gecko go off of food. Now, the next one is probably one of the most important ones, but it doesn't always affect the leopard gecko's appetite. So that's why I didn't really have it super high up on the list. These ones at the very top right here, these 3, new gecko, ovulation, brumation, those are like the go-to 3 that I usually check. But there's still a lot of important ones that we're getting to that are very important that we need to go over. And so parasites is obviously one of those. Parasites are naturally inside of almost every single reptile we have in the hobby. And one of those reasons is because it's in our food. It's in mealworms, it's in cockroaches, it's in silkworms, hornworms, it's in especially crickets. Pinworms is big in crickets, which is why bearded dragon breeders oftentimes preemptively treat their bearded dragons twice a year with parasite medication. Now, I don't like to treat my leopard geckos with parasite medication because parasite medication also strips the stomach and the gut, its digestive system, of good bacteria and microbes and all those kinds of things that the gecko, in my opinion, is beneficial to have for the gecko. And so medication is like a last resort for geckos with parasites or that you're suspecting has parasites, because most geckos will just deal with the parasites. There's something called being asymptomatic in leopard geckos, and pinworms and hookworms are of the least concern. Actually, let me clarify that. I don't know too much about hookworms, but I did do a video top right corner here of pinworms, hookworms, coccidia, and crypto. I know about coccidia, I know about crypto, I know about pinworms, because those are the three that you find mainly in leopard geckos, and I've studied those extensively to give you my opinion on it. I don't think hookworms, I really remember anybody in the leopard gecko hobby testing positive for hookworms, but pinworms is popular, coccidia is popular, and crypto is all popular in leopard geckos. So let's go through these real quick. Pinworms are often found in crickets, and they are like the least concern. Most leopard geckos will just deal with pinworms, and it's not even an issue. They won't lose any weight or anything like that. Pinworms are also the only one out of these four that are visible to the naked eye. They actually look like, well, let me just show you. They actually look like little pins, like this, little worms, so to speak. And as you could read about simply off Google, if you just did a quick search, they do like to hang around the host, or in this case, it would be the gecko's butt area, and they lay their eggs around that area. You can find them crawling out of the butt of the gecko. They could be inside of the gecko. So pinworms, you definitely don't want them, but they are visible, they are treatable, and they're not super dangerous to the animal. Hookworms, again, I'm going to skip that because I don't know much about it and I haven't heard much about it in leopard geckos specifically, but coccidia is another popular one that you see in leopard geckos, and this one you can't see with your naked eye, and this one is a little bit more serious. When your gecko has coccidia, there's a different type of parasite medication that you need to use that is different than the pinworm medication specifically for coccidia. This is a great website here that I always recommend to people called beardeddragon.co. And if you are looking for parasite medication or anything like that, this is the place to go. So fenbendazole is the most commonly used one in the reptile hobby. This could be used for animals that are coming in from importation. It's just a general dewormer, but when you get into coccidia, there's actual different medications here that you could use to treat coccidia specifically. So you can see there's this toltrazuril right here, and I think there was another one, different percentage mixtures. Now, the bad thing about this website is they cannot give you medical advice. They can only sell you these products. But the good thing is that if you went to a vet just to get a worm test plus the examination fee, plus they charge you, I think it's like $25 for this, and you can see it's only $7.95 here. So all in all, you're going to spend $100 to $200 at the vet to get this right here, which you could buy for $7.95 off of beardeddragon.co. So great website. They have many other things that they sell: cleaners and disinfectants, first aids, gecko diets, all kinds of stuff that they have. And last but not least, Cryptosporidium, crypto for short, the nickname sticktail in the leopard gecko hobby. This is by far the worst that you can get because there is no medication that can treat it whatsoever, and it's extremely contagious. If you have fruit flies in your operation, if you're touching the leopard geckos, touching the poop, and then touching another gecko, if a tub is not cleaned super thoroughly and like treated with UV rays outside, UV rays is like the only thing that can kill the oocysts, the eggs of crypto. You can't even kill it with like bleach or alcohol, and they just stick to plastic and all that kind of stuff. So that's why whenever I'm deep cleaning my tubs, I always treat them outside with UV radiation. That is the 100% way to make sure that you get crypto or crypto eggs that might be lingering in any of your stuff. And again, a lot of animals can be asymptomatic, and crypto is something that came into the hobby with leopard geckos a long time ago. It was a huge deal a long time ago, and it's not as big of a deal right now, but it's still floating around the hobby, and you still see it rear its ugly head. So if you have any geckos that are very skinny, they're not reacting to parasite treatments, they're not gaining any weight, my recommendation would be to euthanize the gecko and then throw away everything that belonged to that gecko, or wash it really good with like Dawn dish soap and water and set it out in the sun for a few days in direct sunlight so that every inch of the decoration or the cage is hit by UV rays, and that will destroy any eggs that might be left over from the crypto. So number 7 that we're going to jump to is improper temperatures. There's actually a lot of new research and new observation that I'm hearing about recently to show that leopard geckos have a much wider temperature adjustability range for digesting than we give them credit for. They tend to regurgitate when they are dropped into and out of temperature zones that they're not used to, but they can acclimate to colder zones if they are given time. I've never tried this myself. I would like to experiment with this in the future. As you guys know, I currently run ambient room temperature so that all day long the room of our leopard geckos stays between a low of 80 as it fluctuates throughout the day and then a high of 85, 86 as it fluctuates throughout the day, maybe even 87 sometimes. But there is this period of fluctuation and it allows the geckos to be able to gather enough heat within their bodies to digest their food. Now, before you get too judgy on the ambient room temperature thing, anyone who uses back heating is using ambient temperature. So the two commonly used methods of heating leopard geckos are belly heat, which means the gecko is sitting on top of the heat, which is great, and I used to use belly heat, or back heat, which means that the back of the rack that the leopard gecko is in is being heated so that the air temperature in the back is warmer. And that's essentially ambient heating at that point. You're no longer heating one surface directly, but you're heating the entire air of the back of that cubby to a certain temperature. So a lot of people like to get snippy and judgy on the whole ambient thing, but think about it a little bit. Back heat is pretty much ambient heat. Now, if the temperatures spike too high, if the geckos are in 90, 95, 100 degree temperatures and they're not able to cool themselves down, that might cause stress, or too low might cause stress. I've personally talked to people that said that they had no heat source on their geckos in the low 70s and their geckos adjusted and adapted. Now, in my observation, I have no leopard geckos that regurg at this 85 temperature range that I keep my rooms in now. But back when I experimented with a little bit lower, if I drop the temperature to like maybe 83 or something, there might be a couple leopard geckos maybe that are at the bottom of the rack that are a couple degrees cooler than the rest of the room or something like that. Those leopard geckos, I was noticing a couple, not a lot, maybe one regurg every now and then. But again, I'm a perfectionist. I don't want any regurges, right? So that's why I raised it to 85. But what I think is going on with leopard geckos is that if you give them a little bit of time to adjust, they will adjust to whatever temperature range they wind up being in, whether it's the 70s or the 80s. Now, can they go colder than that? I don't know. Time will tell. I think some experimentation needs to be done, but I certainly think that for now, while we don't have the experimentation and we don't know these answers, giving them a hot spot of somewhere between 85 to 90 to 95, that seems to be what's best and comfortable, and you see no regurgitations whatsoever. But just keep in mind, if your leopard gecko goes off food, maybe you have the temperatures too high in the room, maybe you have the temperatures too low. The next thing that I see that is common with leopard geckos that may go off of food is, again, a physical stress factor of stuck shed. So make sure that you have humid hides inside of your cages. I can't tell you this enough. Some leopard geckos, again, can shed without a humid hide just fine, and that might be because the room that they're in is a little bit more moist than other people's rooms, or they just have really good moisture retention in their skin, and when they drink water and stuff, it just retains enough moisture that they could shed without an additional humid hide. But again, to play the safe side, you 100% want a humid hide that is kept damp all the time. You don't want it wet like a swamp, but you want it damp and misted like good spongy soil so that the gecko has enough humidity to be able to go inside, shed its skin, and not get stressed out at all. Because if a gecko cannot shed its skin, the layers of skin start to bundle up month after month after month around the gecko's arms, tail tip, toes, feet, face, eyes. It starts to bundle up, and it can cause eye infections, bacteria infections. It can cause amputation of the arms, the toes, the tail, the legs, all of those kinds of things if it's not treated. So stuck shed is very important to avoid in leopard geckos. and it is so easy to avoid with a simple humid hide. Alrighty, next you want to test your environment. Reason number 9, make sure there's not too much bright lighting, no hides, no frequent water. You should be changing your leopard gecko's water at least once a week to avoid higher levels of stress. They do enjoy some fresh water once a week, and if you're doing it less than that, or if you have no water at all, or if you have bright lights and no hides, and they're in this glass tank and they just feel ultimately exposed to the entire world, that could put them in a state of stress and fear and anxiety and cause them not to eat. The next thing ties into temperature a little bit, but not fully. So impaction is when leopard geckos get food or debris stuck inside of their body, specifically the digestion tract. So the stomach going into the intestines, going out the butt area where they would poop. Through that process, if you're using calcium sand, if you're using 100% sand that is loose, because leopard geckos lick everything, they're naturally eating substrate all day long as they lick. So you want to be careful, preferably not to use 100% sand, and definitely not calcium sand, because there's been some kind of correlation between calcium sand and impaction in the past. You could kind of research it. I don't know if any scientific labs have proved anything specifically, but there's been enough cases of people who have used calcium sand and then their gecko died from impaction to where I think it should be a red flag alert on your mind that this is something that can happen. Something other people try is washed play sand from like Home Depot. That is not as big of a risk. A matter of fact, if you watch some of my earliest videos, I experimented with washed play sand and even breeding on washed play sand. Now, I wound up giving up washed play sand altogether, which I could talk about in another video if you really want to know, but just the loose particles and the risk of infection to the boys' hemipenes while breeding, and the fact that they were pooping out sand in their poop. I just didn't like all of that, and I was like, nah, I'm not going to use sand, especially for a breeding operation. But I did experiment with it for a while. Now, pure dirt like Eco Earth or peat moss, that is really good. But again, the geckos could be licking it up, especially if you have mulch or wood chips inside of that dirt or that soil. They could always eat it, right? Get it stuck in their mouth, get it stuck in their stomach. These are rare, but it certainly could happen. And then, of course, food. Mealworms, cockroaches, hornworms, superworms. They're eating
the dogs. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there.
They're eating that stuff, and in theory, a leopard gecko's body should break that all down. But sometimes, especially if their temperatures might be too low, they will usually regurgitate the meal if the temperatures are too low, but every now and then, maybe they don't regurgitate it and it stays impacted in their body, and then that starts to rot and gather bacteria, and it can cause an infection that would ultimately lead to death. So to avoid any type of impaction, the solution is increase your temperatures. Anywhere between 90 to 100 degrees, you should not be seeing impaction issues whatsoever, unless the gecko is not going over to the hot spot because it's so stressed out from stuck shed, a bright environment, parasites. There are reasons why a leopard gecko, it would not act like a leopard gecko and go bask if it's stressed out from these other things. So this whole list is really important to check off and to make sure it's not multiple of these that could be tying into the issue. The next one is certainly rare, but does happen, and it's possible. Organ failure. So you got blood clotting, organ disease, liver disease, heart disease, pancreatic disease. There's, just like human beings can get diseases, animals can get diseases too. Animals can get tumors as well, not just linked to the lemon frost gene. There are reptiles in the hobby every single year get tumors and die from tumors, even outside of the lemon frost mutation. If you don't know about the lemon frost mutation, I'll leave a link to that video here in the top right corner. And of course, heart attack. I personally have experienced this, and I've seen other breeders talk about their experience with this. A perfectly healthy, young gecko, housed individually, everything it needs, dead the next day. Adult already, right? But a young adult, sometimes random death just happens and you don't know what it is. All right, the next one is eye infection, which could be caused by stuck shed. If the gecko is getting layers of stuck shed, the more layers they gather, the more difficult it gets them to shed, and it just starts piling up like a snowman and becomes super high prone for bacteria infection, and bacteria infection can and will lead to death if not treated. And so an eye infection is something you definitely want to avoid. It often will be resembled by pus coming out the eye, visual barriers being stuck on the eye, a goopy eye like a water drop that is constantly stuck on the eye. All of those could be signs of bacteria infection. And now, unfortunately for this, beardeddragon.co does not sell eye drops or anything like that, at least to my prior knowledge. But what you want to be doing is going to the vet and getting a cream like a lotion cream called neomycin and polymyxin B sulfates and bactotratsin zinc ophthalmic ointment. Just show this to your vet. I will actually type out the name of it here in this document. This is by far the best treatment, because if you use eye drops, leopard geckos are like hydrophobic. They repel water like it's casting out a demon or something like that. It is crazy. So you need cream or gels or ointments to be able to soothe over their eyes so that they can't lick it off or anything like that. And this stuff works fantastic. And medication like that, I would actually recommend that you keep it in a reptile medicine cabinet. I keep all kinds of stuff just in preparation in case I need to use it. I'll keep parasite medication on hand. I'll keep eye infection medication on hand. I'll keep sanitizing, all kinds of sanitizing chemicals on hand, as well as wound cleaners, especially when you deal with tegus and big lizards that might be able to get big cuts and hurt each other while breeding or anything like that. It's important to have these things before you need it rather than having to go get it when you need it, especially if you need it in an emergency case from a vet. It's going to cost you an arm and a leg compared to if you just have it in your reptile medicine cabinet ready to go. So the 13th and second to last one, which was originally the last one before I added this new one here, is to go along with eye infection is eye deformity. Now, there are certain health conditions or genetic morphs that might be more prone to eye deformities. So take super snows, for example. It's never recommended to breed a super snow to another super snow because super snows have a weaker level of genetic bone structure, and so when you breed a super snow to another super snow, it almost always will compound into squishy faces, angled faces, poor bone structure around the faces, and so you do want to avoid super snow to super snow breeding. But every now and then in the snow and super snow project, if there's too much inbreeding going on, you're probably going to see some bad face structure. And then of course NDBE, which stands for, I think it's like a French term, nor desire black eyes. I don't know if I said that correctly, but you could look it up on Google. NDBE leopard gecko, you will see. Now, this is actually a popular trait that is found in a lot of really high-end bloodlines of leopard geckos because it originally started with and became known to be linked more to the mandarin bloodline of leopard geckos. And so pretty much anytime that you have mandarins now in the hobby, you have to be aware of NDBE possibly being traced back somewhere in that lineage. But if you're not really inbreeding too much and you are just making sure that you're not breeding NDBEs when and if they do occur, you should be able to avoid this completely. I work with a lot of Mandarin. I will never give up Mandarin because Mandarin is one of the best bloodlines of leopard geckos for producing the most orange, the most red, the most carrot tail, and never to say the less lava black knights and Mandarin black knights and all this kind of cool stuff that really brings in a lot of potential for projects and different directions that you can go. So Mandarin is and always will be a super popular trait within leopard geckos. It's just NDBE has kind of been linked to that in the past, so you just want to be aware of that. Now, not all NDBEs have an eye issue where their eyes are squinty or short or they can't open them all the way. Not all NDBEs are like that, but certainly a noticeable amount are, and so it's something that you just want to be aware of. And unfortunately, NDBE is what's called a recessive gene, meaning that it can have one copy hiding inside of any leopard gecko, and you wouldn't know it unless you specifically tested that gecko out, or if you had the ability to run a genetic test on its genome or genetic code, which we don't have yet specifically for leopard geckos available to the public. I know there are some scientists and some leopard gecko breeders, such as Steve Sykes from Geckos, etc., that are working on genetically being able to test the genome for what morphs and recessives and hidden genes might be lying inside of your geckos, but I don't think we're anywhere close to that being something possible for us to test for anytime in the next couple years. And then also, an eye deformity doesn't have to be linked to super snow and bad bone structure or NDBE. It could just be random. Sometimes leopard geckos are just randomly born with poor eye structure, poor eye opening, poor face, eyebrow. The cool thing about leopard geckos is they actually have muscles on their eyes so they can open and close their eyes, which I think is one of the reasons why they're cuter than crested geckos, gargoyle geckos, leachianus geckos, because those geckos are just like, they can't close their eyes, so they're just looking at you 24/7. A matter of fact, you don't know how they're feeling. If a leopard gecko is stressed, it kind of will like close its eyes, walk away, kind of push away. It looks like a human that when a human is stressed, right? Like, oh no, I don't want that. That's what a leopard gecko looks like. But a crested gecko or leachianus gecko, they're just like, and you can't tell if they're actually stressed other than them frantically moving around. So like one day I had my gargoyle gecko just sitting on my lap, right? And I couldn't tell that he was feeling stressed, so I just slowly moved my hand over to him so that he would get on top of my hand. And what does the little sucker do? Bites me. Now, if that was a leopard gecko and the leopard gecko was sitting on my lap like this, with its eyes closed, I'd probably know, hey, this guy doesn't want to be bugged right now. Because if you know anything about reptile body language, when they're closing their eye to you, and this is for bearded dragons, sailfin dragons, monitor lizards, tegus, anything like that, they close their eye to you means that they want to imagine that you don't exist. They want to pretend that you don't exist and you're not there and you're not going to bug them. And when they open their eyes, they're hoping that you're gone. But in reality, we never are because, you know, we're reptile geeks and nerds and we want to be able to handle our reptiles. But that's the problem with crested geckos, gargoyle geckos, leachianus geckos, all kinds of geckos that can't close their eyes. You can't really read the expression on the gecko's face of whether it's feeling like it wants to be left alone or not. So a little bit of a tangent there, but the 14th and last note that we're going to go over in this video is nighttime active. Now, there's been a lot of studies done. So leopard geckos were originally documented to be nocturnal, meaning they come out at night. Then they were classified to be crepuscular, meaning they come out in the evening and the early morning at sunrise and sunset. And then now they're actually classified to be, and I could have swore there was a specific word for this that was different, but maybe this is the word I was looking for, cathimeral, which basically means that the animal is active during hours of daylight and darkness, meaning that they're just opportunistic. If somebody wants to do a little more research into that, I was specifically looking, I thought there was a different word for leopard geckos and how they were classified now as opportunistic activity or eaters, but needless to say, I'm going to give my observation. Leopard geckos usually sleep when it's bright out and daytime, and then they usually come out in the evening into the night for a little bit, and then they sleep in the night as well. So in my observation, the most active hours of a leopard gecko is typically going to be around 5 to 6 p.m. all the way up to 10 p.m. to midnight, which is why I did all my breedings of leopard geckos and stuff and developed like an owl late night work schedule, because I would breed leopard geckos up till like 2 a.m. in the morning and stuff like that. But eventually they do go to sleep and they stop moving around. But in my observation, you're looking at a most active period between 5 p.m. when the lights start going down and somewhere around 11 p.m. to midnight is when they're most active. Now, I'm not up right now in my life at 4 a.m., 5 a.m., 6 a.m., so I can't really observationally observe that. But if some of you guys have witnessed your leopard geckos going to sleep and then waking up at like 6 a.m. or something when the sun comes up, let me know. I love for observational evidence. And we also need to remember that just because leopard geckos act a certain way in the wild doesn't mean they're automatically going to replicate that in captivity. They've been bred for 50 plus years now in captivity. They're so domesticated that they got handleability and calmness bred into them for the most part compared to other reptiles and stuff. So they're kind of like the dogs of the reptile world. They're nowhere near as skittish as they used to be when they came in from the wild, just because of tens of years and dozens of years of being bred in captivity and handled and domesticated. They're adjusting genetically, they're evolving to this environment of being captively housed, captively kept, captively bred, and captively raised. So their behaviors might change. But for me, what I notice is most geckos will come out in the evening time into the nighttime. So whenever somebody's like, oh, my gecko's not eating, one of the questions I ask is, when are you trying to feed it? Are you feeding it at 2 o'clock in the afternoon with bright white lights on when the gecko is inside of its hide trying to be in darkness? Because yeah, then it's probably not going to eat. But if you feed it around 5 to 6 p.m., or if you feed it around when the leopard gecko actually comes out of its hide and is walking around, and then you offer it food, that would be a suggestion of how to get your leopard gecko to eat. Just keep in mind that they are mostly evening to nighttime active, and a solution to all 14 of these problems, in addition to the solutions that I talked about individually for each problem, is you could always try new foods. And here I'll even provide like the main foods that you could try for your leopard geckos. So you would want to try hornworms, silkworms, crickets, dubia roaches, waxworms. Although I've never tried waxworms, but I hear that a lot of leopard geckos can get stuck on them. So maybe you want to avoid waxworms because you don't want that to be their consistent diet. There's not enough balance of like protein to fat ratios and all that in there where you want them eating that specifically. Black soldier fly larva was another recent addition to the reptile hobby that's become really popular, but my personal favorite is just mealworms, guys. You could do superworms, but mealworms is my personal favorite. They're small, they're cheap. You could go to rainbowmealworms.net and get your mealworms delivered right to your door. You could leave them in a little escape-free bowl, and the gecko will just walk over to it and eat it throughout the day and the night, or the weeks as you keep that bowl in there. They will just eat it at their leisure. So that is my video on the 14 reasons why your leopard gecko is not eating. Did I miss any reasons? Did I overcover this topic? Did I satiate the informational curiosity that you had for wanting to know why your leopard gecko is not eating? Please let me know in a comment below. Your feedback means everything to me. Your support means everything to me, and I thank you guys so much for that. I have a lot of leopard gecko videos that I still plan on making, and I'm always looking for recommendations. So until next time, my friends, stay safe, pursue your reptile passion, and have a geeky gecko great day. Peace.